My guest today is Professor Joanna Bryson, Professor of Ethics and Technology at the Hertie School in Berlin. She holds degrees in social and computer sciences from Chicago, Edinburgh, and MIT, and her research spans natural and artificial intelligence, AI transparency, and the governance of technology. She's one of the field's most consistently cited voices on AI ethics and policy, having advised governments, companies, and NGOs around the world, and her work has appeared everywhere, from Science to the pages of Wired. And I think what's particularly interesting, a lot of the things that I read that Joanna wrote were written before 99% of people have ever heard of AI. So, so I'm quite curious to know whether your feelings or views have changed in that time. So, one of the things in the correspondence we shared before talking, you were very keen to draw a clear line between the connections humans form to AI and the connections between humans and AI, which implies a mutuality that you reject. I wonder if you could unpack the distinction between the relationships we form with AI and the belief that we're having a relationship with AI.
Okay. So I wouldn't say that we do form a relationship with AI, because I think of a relationship as being necessarily bidirectional. And so the relationship, what does it mean for a digital service provider to have a relationship with you? Well, if it's actually, Twitter or Microsoft or something like that, then they may have some kind of financial relationship with you, or they may just have some kind of profile. But for the technology itself to have a relationship with you, I don't think it's a really sensible category. I guess it's a category failure, as they say. So you on the other hand, definitely people believe they are experiencing a relationship, and so they, like, in their brain, psychologically, it may be incredibly similar to forming a relationship, if not with another person, but with maybe like with a character on a favorite character on a television show, or a book that you've read that you fantasize about, maybe you're in love with a plant. I don't mean to offend anyone. Maybe with your pets. There with a pet, it definitely does have it has a set of concepts, expectations. It can like you, it can dislike you if you're abusive to your pet, which I'm sure you're not. But the bidirectionality that you have, with a parrot or a dog, is, or even some fish, it's nothing like what happens when you just there's a giant computer program, and for maybe 2 billion users, there's little pieces of hopefully isolated memory that remembers what you previously said. And maybe they've bought other information about you, or they're tying into other resources, but it's just like, it's a software, it's a program. There's something called memory, which really means you're just storage. It's like shelves, but in a computer, right? And there's just, that's where the stuff is stored about what you've previously said, and much more importantly, what the other billions of people that have information, or have data that's been stored on the internet that was used to train the AI in the first place, what they said. And so when if you're talking about generative AI, when an answer is generated, it's based mostly on what it's basically like a library lookup into everything that was in the training data about what's the most likely thing to say next, given what you just said. And then there's a little tiny bit, which is a memory of, for example, what you just said, and maybe what you've said for 18 months earlier. I was astonished. I don't use generative AI a lot, but I do a little, just so that I can keep up with what's happening in the field. And I was astonished, because I was having it do very mundane tasks, to have the Google generative AI bring in something really weird that had nothing to do with the task. And then it turned out that it was something that I'd said more than a year earlier. I'd asked some question. And then I'm like, how, I'm in the EU. How long are you retaining data? And do you have my consent to retain that data? And they're like, well, by default, you have 18 months of your data, and otherwise, and basically you have a choice of, you can cut that down, I think, to maybe 6 months, or have no memory at all, in which case you can't have a conversation, right? You can't even use it at all. And like, this is consent. So anyway, sorry, maybe I've taken too long to answer.
No. I think it's all.
But do you kind of get what I'm saying there?
No, 100%. No, 100%. And I think that's what I think people perhaps confuse themselves by not recognizing that 99% of the relationship I have with Claude is the same as another person's relationship with Claude. It's that maybe even that 0.1% that's different. And I think that's where people perhaps anthropomorphize and layer on human qualities to their AI
Yeah.
because they want their AI to know them, to understand them, and to be able to interact with them.
Well,
So people, sorry.
Don't apologize. I interrupted you, but but I think what's confusing about that is, again, what's been absolutely genius about what they've done with the generative AI is that, like I said, it is kind of a library access. You're not just pulling a particular book, but you are picking out of like this huge space of kinds of conversations. And so your interaction with Claude might be very different from somebody else's interaction with Claude. Or you might even have a couple different logins where you talk about different things, and you can construct different persona. You can give prompts. And what you have to understand is that you're going out and somehow some of your stuff is accessing, like, one of my friends switched programming languages to Rust and was astonished that whatever, I don't remember which tool he was using, but suddenly it totally changed the way it sounded from the boring kind of person that was had been doing, I don't know, C++ or whatever before, to like the kitty bitty that did Rust, and it was using all the same language that those people had used. But he had just moved by changing computer language. He had moved into a different set of comment space about different kinds of people that were putting in the comments when they do their GitHub check-ins, and so he got a different language. And you can do the same. You can like direct it to stick you into like Jane Austen land and have a very Jane Austen experience, or a feminine experience, or whatever it is that you want to have. And then you can also have, like, I often put my prompts, partly because I don't want to waste a lot of energy or tokens or whatever. I try to make it sound like the Star Trek computer and just say, working, acknowledged, stuff like that, so.
So almost related to that, I guess, you wrote a blog post back in 2018 for the UN University called AI and Global Governance, No One Should Trust AI. And you stated that AI legal persons will be the ultimate shell company.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because subsequent to that, we've seen instances where companies like Replica AI, for example, haven't been held responsible for actions that people perhaps have done because they believe they're in contact with an AI. And I think their notion, the same as social media, I guess, is that we've created these platforms as interactive tools. What people decide to do with them is their responsibility. Do you think that's defensible, or is it very much AI companies in their core fundamental programming should be held accountable?
Right. Okay. Really interesting question. And then I'm going to have to unpack it a little. And let me start out by saying that I had another paper that came out in 2017 that first said that thing about the shell company. So it was a formal paper with legal academics. So I want to acknowledge Tom Grant and Michaelis Diamantis as my other two co-authors. I don't remember which of us came up with that expression. But then I reused it. I think it was me, and that's why I reused it in the blog post that the UN asked me to write. But the main thing is you have to also understand trust. If by trust you just mean I have an expectation that it's going to work, well, then you can trust things like Google and AI and a bridge. But I was using the sociological sense of trust. So trust is a set of relationships between people that are able to enforce penalties if the trust is violated. And so this is one of the reasons we don't like to be in situations like we are right now, with very high inequality and a breakdown of accountability and responsibility as a consequence. There was sort of a profound point being made there about that. Now I've digressed enough. That was about the nature of trust. I've slightly forgotten the question you ended up with. Could you reiterate?
It was, so I think one of the almost defenses that AI companies use is that they created these tools in the same way I built a hammer. What you do with a hammer is down to you, really. So they're almost trying to put the responsibility back on the people using the interactive tool, not the developers of the tool itself.
Yeah, it's your responsibility to understand how to use it. Yeah, this is really interesting because so one of the things that I at some point got asked, again, sort of around that same time, to talk to a bunch of judges in the United States, senior judges, like federal judges, and that wasn't the only one there. There was a couple other senior AI people too, but they were very relieved when finally, towards the last day, we got them to understand that it's just like a car, like it could be, there's definitely stuff that's the driver's fault, that you drove when you were intoxicated, or
Yeah.
that, you didn't look behind you before you backed up, something like that. And then there's definitely stuff that is the car company's fault. Like, a properly maintained car, the brakes fail because of some mechanical mistake in the construction process. And so courts have to decide which of those two things have happened, and they've always had to decide that. And the judges were just massively relieved to say, oh, we just have to keep doing that. Okay, we get that. Because they were worried that there was some third entity in between, but there really isn't. And so but the really interesting thing about where your question is going there is that when you generate this AI speech, is that the same as social media? Or is it now becoming more like a newspaper? So a German judge has just found, in the case of Google, that the AI summaries are not search results. So search results, they say, okay, Google doesn't have a liability for what is found on the internet. That's okay that they serve it to you. But when you do that synthesis, which is to make the AI summary, they say, okay, now Google is liable. And so this is a really recent result. It's one country, but it's a big one. It's the third largest economy in the world. So we'll see. We'll see. I will see how that shakes out. That's a coming thing. So, I would think that if that is held up, then replica too, because the AI is synthesizing a lot of things. They're basically also using generative AI at this point, as far as I understand with replica. Then they too would be synthesizing what is said. So if inappropriate things are said, then that could be there could be liability on this behalf of replica. Now, what you do when somebody says something, even if it is immoral to you, is another question. And I do really worry about the number of people that have, like, there's one, every death is a tragedy. But if one teenager takes their life, because teenagers unfortunately do that, right? If one teenager takes their life after talking to ChatGPT, I want to know, for all the teenagers talking to ChatGPT, do they have a raised, an elevated chance of committing suicide, or a reduced chance? Because maybe a bunch of them are helped and some of them are hurt, and still we have to try to figure that out. But another way to say it is maybe most of them are helped and some aren't, right? And in that case, really, then you wouldn't think ChatGPT or whatever was culpable. I didn't mean to name one brand there. But I think it's really, really important to understand that even when we can see these very clear failures, that we need to think about, like, what were the net impacts on other people, and what are we doing. But I do feel like there is something culpable in the presenting these things as, and it's not just how they present it. I should say, I hope I'm not going at too much length here, but I was at the AI Action Summit in February of 2025, about 3 weeks after Trump had come into office. And one of the most frightening things I saw there, and I will name a company, and it is OpenAI. There was a woman for OpenAI, and it was a panel about international security, and she was absolutely talking like she was a priestess of the oracle, like this is like like Delphi or something. And she was saying, I really appreciate that the United Kingdom and the United States is giving us the kind of intelligence information that a corporation would not normally be privy to, so that I can bring this to the model and I can find out what, I'm just like, no, like, first of all, how are these countries giving that kind of data to this entity, which like, sometimes they're saying, oh yeah, we want to be infrastructure of the world. And then other times they're like, well, ransomware, we have to say, we have to make business decisions about whether it's worth being careful about that. It's just like, you cannot say that you're critical infrastructure and also say, oh, we're just a business, right? You can't be both. There is something else that is to be a utility. And I do think this is one of the big problems we're in right now. The United States stopped recognizing new utilities and regulating them as utilities. So there are extra privileges that come when you have this kind of market concentration, that you tend to get for things that are networked like this. But there are also, so you make a lot of money, basically, is your privilege. But there's extra costs, which mean higher regulation. It does not mean like extra privileges, like in terms of like being trusted with international security. That's insane. So.
It's fascinating. So we're having a similar debate in the UK right now. So there's a big, mostly US, but a big global company called Palantir,
Mhm.
and as, depending who you listen to, who you believe, they're either the devil incarnate, or they're sent by God to sort of heal the world. And I think one of the fears is that if we, I think it was to be and Palantir was to be embedded within our National Health Service and within our sort of defence industries, and there's almost a fear that once we allow it in,
Mhm.
we can never get rid of it. You can't sort of wander. No, in 3 years' time, right? No, we're going to turn that off. We're going to go with somebody else, because they have so much of our data, our knowledge, our insight, and we're making decisions based on the predictions that they've made. Then suddenly just stop that. Where does that leave you? And I think that's one of the things people don't necessarily understand is that once you're in bed with the devil or an angel, it's very hard to get out of bed with them.
Well, okay, that's a really, really, really super interesting way of phrasing all this. I wouldn't be one of the people that either thinks that Palantir itself is the devil incarnate, or that it's like the best thing since sliced bread. But I think of it as a software company, and that's very, very, very good at helping people automate and digitalize. But the concern is the owners, right? So the concern is that they are literally openly talking about culture war, and that we need to defend the West,
Yeah.
and basically racist. And so the question is, how much does the fact that the owners of the company have these attitudes affect the product itself, affect whether or not you can really trust it, trust the company, or whether you should be using them because of exactly what you said. So I can imagine, it seems to me that they're sort of a hybrid, they're sort of a consultancy. So they go in and they help you digitalize. And ideally, there's no reason when they go in and do that with their expertise that they couldn't leave all the data where it is. If you had internal servers, or stored on Amazon or Google, or both. I personally currently have my email splitting and getting cloned and going to 2 different servers in 2 different continents, just so I increase the probability that I can get it if I need it. So there's no reason that you couldn't do that kind of thing. But and there's no reason, once the software is written, because that's the hard part, and you've
Yeah.
understood that way. The business stuff is, in principle, there's no reason that somebody else couldn't maintain that software, right? But the question is, do people have the competence to do that? Can we find other people to do that? If we had more equitable, like a more even balanced geopolitics, then I would say, so test it, so kick them out, make them demonstrate to you that somebody else can replace them, but you need to have a lot of expertise to really tell, like, is there really no data flow still happening, to the West Coast? I mean, they're claiming, from some of the people I've talked to, that no data flows at all. Everything's encrypted. They don't have any access to it. But do even their own employees know that? I've forgotten who it was. It wasn't Kernigan. It must have been Ritchie then, I think. Um, I can't remember. Anyway, one of the people who invented Unix and the language C, they got sort of the computer science equivalent of the Nobel Prize. It was called the Turing Award. And at their Turing Award speech, they showed that they had written a backdoor into the very first C compiler so that they could always log in to any Unix system anywhere in the world. And every Unix system that had been built since then had been compiled using a compiler of the previous generation. And so it was still true, decades after C, whenever this guy got his award. And so, it's the kind of thing that if you're a geek and computer programmer, you go, oh, cool. At least you did in the 70s or 80s or 90s, right?
Yes.
But now you're just thinking that's the kind of thing that can happen. And that means all the employees of Palantir and everybody else could be completely ignorant of the fact that they're actually building backdoors into every company that they go in and help. And they are honestly helping the companies and the police stations and all these other things are honestly, more able to run things, more effectively. I've heard that that people are getting that people who work for Palantir see their processes becoming better and better and better, and they're just and so they are able to provide this service. But the question is, what is left over, and the question is, do we have the kinds of auditors that can go in and check that nothing is left? Now, I've heard that, again, some of my friends, I don't want to name too many people, but some company that you have a chance of having heard of got bought by, were made of friends of mine and were bought by Google at some point. And then they had a like a state level act or cybersecurity event, and they couldn't believe the cleaners that came in from Google that just like they knew what they were doing, and they went through and they figured out what was going on and they fixed it. So some people have those kinds of assets. It's not clear that the most of the world has that, and I'm sure there's like countries in the EU that don't have that, unless like Google really likes them, But this was a contest where it was an expensive asset that Google owned, and then they went in and did that for them.
It's interesting when because you read a lot in the Western media about the sort of fear and accusation that America in particular makes towards China, and they sort of banned Huawei and they won't use DeepSeek for fear that China's put these sort of backdoors into their programs. And you think, but you're doing exactly the same. If we would be very naive if we thought that wasn't the way around. But something else you mentioned there, and I wanted to come back on, and it was, do you feel that the sort of AI and the data capture and the access to all information that governments, companies, whatever, are giving to AI, do you feel that we're going through another iteration of colonization, but this time it's a data-led colonization? Does that make sense as a question?
I think it's a reasonable question that a lot of people are asking. They're asking whether this is a new colonization. So I think this idea is it a new colonization is a reasonable one. I mean, one thing that happened to Africa, even in the last decade, has been that people went in and sold them software with 30-year contracts that was crap, was absolutely
yeah.
And it was absolutely abusive of them. But one thing about that is Africa is saying, well, never again. And so I just saw an article, it's just absolutely astounding, about the way Africa is successfully capturing value with solar. So they've demanded, as China came in, and each country in Africa, and Africa is a continent, obviously, so each country, as China comes in, is saying, you need to maximally use our local capacities, and we want to capture as much value as possible, and we're going to do this, together. And so it's really amazing and astonishing, just in the last like 2 years, the amount of value that various African countries have been able to get out of solar. And so now I'm aware of a few efforts to make sure that the same thing happened with data centers. Like, that they aren't just like coming in and actually, like not only taking your resources, but also abusing your infrastructure or your government wealth or whatever. The Chinese seem to be willing to do this, to really come up with win-win solutions. And so the problem is that can you trust companies? And I know, again, I hesitate, you wind up in some situations where you're in various kind of Chatham situations, but let's just say I believe that a number of countries, our companies, are worried that the dishonesty presently associated with certain aspects of the United States is going to make it harder and harder for them to do business, and they're not sure what to do about that. And they're afraid to tell the people who are causing the problem exactly how much problem they're causing too. Because it's like one of these cases where the messengers get shot a lot. So
yeah, definitely. One of the things you wrote, and I hope I get this right, about 15 years ago, was around robots should be slaves. Well, I think you argued that overuse of the word companion and humanizing AI is something to be concerned about, not celebrated. And just to bring that to life for people. So my mum died of dementia a couple of years ago, and there's lots of press, lots of media talking about companion bots or support bots for sort of dementia patients, robots, robot pets and things that'll make dementia patients feel more, I don't know, feel more heard or have somebody to talk to, etc. So I wondered if sort of 15 years on from you originally writing that, looking at what we've seen develop now, almost are you more fearful of how much we're humanizing AI, or are you leaning into the whole companion robot kind of thing?
I'm definitely not leaning into the companion robot kind of thing. Although I just mostly, again, because of COVID, as we just discussed, I did just have a paper come out that should have come out in like 2020 and came out in 2024. So we're still doing some research into that. Fortunately, with Humboldt University here, Hertie School doesn't really have experimental facilities, so I had to find other people to work with. It was a project that originally started at University of Bath. But anyway, I think there's at least a couple of things going on there, and I should have to reread that paper at some point. But it actually was originally written around 2007 or so, and you're right, it was published in 2010. But also in 2010, we had something called, there was the AI ethics, or no, the robot ethics retreat or something like that. It was British. And one of the outcomes, it wasn't really the plan of the government so much as the academics going, there has to be some outcome. We produced the first national level soft law, which was at that time called the EPSRC, AHRC, which were basically research councils, principles of robotics. And they're remarkably similar to the OECD principles of AI that came out 9 years later, especially given this incredibly long process the OECD did to write theirs, that they somehow converged on almost exactly the same thing. But anyway, the point is that in that, we were very much concerned about this transparency. There were only 5 principles, and one of them was that people shouldn't mistake AI for a person, but rather the machine nature needed to be transparent. And one of the things we argued was that if the machine suddenly didn't have a machine nature, if it really did have needs, well, that should be transparent too. So that was one of the ways we kind of defended this, because a lot of people saw that as making companionship impossible, and they said companionship is important. So I want to briefly go back to the robots should be slaves article. I had written this article about over-identifying with AI twice before, and to the first approximation, nobody had read it. I mean, somebody must have read it because I got invited to invited to write the meeting where I wound up writing the slaves chapter. But I basically decided I'm going to go MIT here and try writing an outrageous title and see if then people read it. And they don't. They read the title, not the rest of the article. The whole rest of the article was about, look, AI is the kind of thing you own, and we've all agreed that we don't own people. And so therefore, given that this is basically a servant we own, we don't want it to be a human servant we own. We should not, there's a moral necessity not to desire to own people. And so I still feel very strongly about this. And I think there's a huge feminist component to it too. This idea that you can have, people say, oh, this is my partner, this is my lover, this is my life companion, over which you have complete dominion that you can turn off and on. Like, what does that even mean? And unfortunately, some people think they have dominion over their especially their wives, usually. But anyway, so that's what makes it a feminist issue to some extent. But of course, anyway, let's not go down the whole trajectory of human rights and how that relates to gender studies. But my point there is that was, and it was ignorant, because again, coming from a white middle, engineering, middle class, whatever, American background, I thought that we'd all agreed that slaves shouldn't be human, that nobody should be owned. And and now I apologize for the title, because you can't disassociate the word slavery from the experience of the people who were slaves. And it's not only me, there's like a whole lot of like IEEE and everything went through and stripped out the master slave kind of metaphor from the engineering practice at that time. But coming forward back to now you have all these kids saying like, well, we need these chatbots because we're so lonely. And it's like, well, guess what? Teenagers have always been lonely. And they don't believe it. They don't believe that people ever used to write, dissertations or long essays, and they don't believe anyone was ever so lonely without a chatbot before. And it's really strange it's some kind of imposter syndrome to think that you couldn't have done what people 2 years ago used to do that were exactly in your situation, right? So I think that's extremely problematic. On the other hand, if you find it easier to be safe, faithful to your spouse, provide a good shelter to your children and everything, if you, spend the nights that you're alone talking to artificial intelligence or even doing other things with artificial intelligence devices, is that a bad thing? And to some extent, that's what happens if, at least for me, when I go to a hotel room, not so much anymore, but I used to work at length at Lego. So I would be away from home for some days. I would put on the television just while I was eating, because I didn't like to eat alone, and just hearing the voices, even though I knew it was only TV, And so as long as people have that kind of understanding, that they understand as a fictional character, that they understand, you know, because you watch movies and you laugh and you cry and you fall in love and whatever, but you understand on some level that it's fiction. Like on another level, you don't. That's why you're having these emotional experiences. And if you meet the actor, you could say, oh, I know that the actor isn't dead, even though the character died, but you still tend to treat the actor like you would have treated the character had you met them. Right. So unless you've seen them in a lot of other films. So anyway, so the point is that that I think at least just as long as we have some explicit understanding of what's going on, it may be, ideally, it should be okay that we also have this sort of fantasy life that we find helps us through tough patches. And that was why I was talking earlier about suicide in that way too. There's less extreme forms of difficulty that you could imagine having it being useful. But the trade-off is that the time you stay home because you don't feel that lonely anymore because you're having this conversation is time that you don't have an opportunity to meet someone that might have been really important, that may have just been right nearby, that would have gone to the same concert tonight that you would have gone to. And so that's the kind of thing that you're reducing your chances. That's a lot of people I know, because we're all geeks, met our spouses when we were doing our master's degrees or graduate degrees. You know, it was when because obviously some people meet them in high school and some in college. But for those of us that had put a lot of time into our career and then said, wait, my life isn't complete, while we go and do graduate degrees, we often find that part of what was not complete was that we hadn't worked out the spousal part. And so that was something that I'm really glad I did. And I didn't just stay home and teach myself off the internet how to program or something and never establish a rich social life, and not only the man I married, but other people too, that are still my ongoing friends that I have a high value to, you know.
It's really interesting. I've got a 16-year-old son and 19-year-old daughter, and both of them know and they believe me when I say that when I was their age, there was no smartphones. We had 3 channels on the television. We had obviously no computers. We had no internet. We had obviously no air, none of those things. And whilst they sort of they obviously know I'm telling them the truth, it's you sort of watch their eyes calculated. But what would I do? What would I do? But I think it's very different. In the UK, we've just passed a law where social media is banned for under 16s. They've got similar laws in Australia. I think Spain. I'm not sure about Germany, but I think there's a big difference between having something and taking it away and never having it at all. Because when I was 16, I had no idea that a smartphone would ever exist apart from watching Star Trek. So, but having a smartphone and suddenly being taken away is something quite different, I think. Just on the and I think I know what your thoughts will be on this, but I might be wrong. Where are you on the benefits or otherwise of so-called grief bots? And let me give just two quick examples. And I know I'm meant to be asking you questions, but I'm talking a lot here. There was an example recently reported in China where a grandmother's grandson had passed away in a motorbike accident. The grandmother was very poorly, and she was never going to see the grandson in person again anyway. But she had a weekly call with them on FaceTime. So they worked with the company, created a digital facsimile of the grandson. She carried on conversing with the grandson until she passed away, and never knew anything different happened. Is that wrong to give her comfort? And then on the other side, if both my parents passed away in the last couple of years, for me to be able to ring up my father and say, "Oh, I just wanted to let you know Alexander passed his driving test, isn't it wonderful?" And him to say, "Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, send him my congratulations." Ethically and morally, where are you on that?
Okay. So it's interesting because I haven't had this conversation in this era. I was more involved with the we started to go there. We didn't quite go there earlier when we were talking about support for the elderly.
Yeah.
I do think elderly and children are fundamentally different.
Yes.
It's not just about age; it's about sort of the terminal conditions. And so I had I had 2 friends who were in a plane crash, and one died, and his brother was never told that he had died, and unfortunately also died after a couple of weeks. And that was a decision by the doctors. This was a competent, intelligent person, but
Yep.
they just thought that was something that he didn't need to know because they were trying so hard to save him. I think when you first started talking, and maybe it's partly the British context, I started thinking about that great movie, Truly, Madly, Deeply,
Yep.
where the idea is somehow, which confused me as a young geek,
Yes.
that for a while you want to go back and revisit what you had and understand it from a different perspective, and then you can internalize enough to move on, right? Which is a very different kind of concept. Again, I feel like if people don't believe, in their heart of hearts, and that's, it does seem like some teenagers actually seriously believe that their friends are talking back to them, and that their friends can come and communicate to them through the chatbot, or it used to be through their Facebook page or something, that they really thought they're having a conversation with them somehow. There's actually at the University of Bath, if you're very interested in this topic, there's something called the Center for Death and Society. And so I learned a lot about that there. But I haven't really kept up on any literature about grief bots per se. I'm just much more aware of the number of people that are saying things like, we have to capture, it's our moral imperative that we have to capture the narratives of say, Holocaust survivors so that they can continue witnessing to kids even after they're dead or something. And that's like a slippery slope. I think we have captured all this information. We have films. Fine, let's have an AI simulation. But to say we have an obligation to preserve some people and not others, I find very troubling. I think, yes, we give them more time and we give them more room on our bookshelves or whatever like that. But to actually say that somehow we're preserving the person doesn't make sense to me. And I think we do have to help really, really think about. So one of the things people are doing is they're talking about these virtual assets as if that's sufficient, and then they're tearing down and burning and bombing the actual museums that offer you proof. This is one of the things autocracy does, is to try to control proof and to control evidence. And it's horrible, to see things just like, unfortunately, Wahhabism is like this. It's just like, you burn down everything because the past should be irrelevant. All that matters is your relationship between you and God. Well, that sounds nice, but it means you have no evidence left of what actually happened and to know which stories to believe. And when you can actually go and see the locations and have some idea of which stories you were told seem to be more accurate, that helps. So so I think that when I talk about grief bots, that's what I worry about. I think it's important for any kind of therapeutic thing that we remember this is science. And so you go out and see, does there seem to be a benefit? And you try to do that in a controlled situation where there's people that can debrief and really help someone that if they do go down some kind of a spiral. We can't just leave it to like natural experiments of who randomly chooses to use these bots because it's not random. It may be a certain kind of exploitable person that winds up being the ones who are more likely to use it. And so that doesn't give us any information about what would happen on average, what was the improvement or the cost associated with that interaction. So anything like this, where you're really talking about what is that welfare outcomes, I think we have a moral obligation to do medical tests and find out. It's not just about guessing.
No, and my sort of, I guess, science fiction brain goes towards, gosh, well, what happened if Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, whoever decided to digitalize themselves and decided actually they could remain in power forever because you're talking to Trump, Putin, etc. So why would you need somebody else? That's my fear, I think.
Yeah, and we've had that problem for decades. You've been able to buy like chatbot versions of yourself for enough millions of rubles for a while, because there were people that were gullible, and actually, in a way, wills are like that. It's kind of really weird that somebody that's dead should dictate where money goes, right? So it's something that
that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's something we've found to, in a way, to solve certain kinds of problems and to smooth our social path forwards. But maybe we need to come up with better ways where to do that.
It's interesting. I talked to somebody earlier this week, a doctor called Anna Strasser, and she did an experiment with Daniel Dennett where she created a DigiDan, a digital version of Daniel Dennett.
I know her. I used to know him. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and she was saying that it's whilst he was alive, and then obviously the agreement was the digital version of Dan would be killed off when Daniel sadly passed away as well. And she was saying in the beginning it was very hard to distinguish between the two of them. And then because it went on and on and on, the hallucinations became more and more extreme. So it was obvious it was diverging from the path. But initially, he said it was impossible to tell the difference between the two of them, and that was a few years ago now. So now you think things would get better and better, but there is that hallucination, whether it be at 20%, 10%, 5%, 1%, whatever. It just isn't. It isn't the person. It's not. It's just a digital facsimile at a point in time of capturing what they've said and what they believe, I guess.
So I was one of the people who was a part of one of her experiments, because somebody who did know him, and other people who knew his writings better than I did were also among. And yeah, we were at chance, or even worse than chance. And so Dan himself came to the conclusion that, look, you know, as a philosopher, you're not known for every paper you write. You're known for really your best stuff. And
Yeah.
so it was kind of good that his friends. So at first he was surprised that his friends couldn't tell who was really him, but then he was like, well, it was kind of flattering that his friends thought he was always so genius as this thing that was trained off of his most popular papers, right? And that you know, by the time this happened, he was an older man anyway, and he basically. He was remarkably philosophical about it. You know, he wasn't one of those philosophers that seemed very philosophical all the time, but this was one time he really did seem to be so. I didn't know about this problem with the divergence, but I could believe that basically the more you interact, then of course the more data you have and the more the experience is different. Then I had a very unusual life, and obviously I thought a lot. And you're not going to have the same kind of grounding. It's not just about like what did he say, it's about who had he talked to, and what books had he read, and who were his friends that he would call up if he had a question. And one of the great things about being friends with him was that he would just send you these really short emails about something you were an expert in. He would just remember and say, Joanna, what about this? And then you know. And so it was very flattering. So anyway, you know, no bot is going to be all that stuff, and that's the bot can be a good index again into his existing literature, but it can't really project that much into what's going to happen. I think.
So I don't think this is necessarily your area, but I'd be fascinated in your view. So I wonder if you had any sympathy with, I think, a growing number of people, including people like Geoffrey Hinton, Richard Dawkins, Blake Lamar, who believe that AI is showing signs of consciousness. And for the layperson, what difference would it make if AI did have consciousness?
Okay, so I am an outlier on this particular problem. So, and you mentioned that I have a paper in Wired. So if you really, I wrote that one after I'm terrible with names, the Blake guy, whatever his name was, that was specifically about that. And I forget the title. I knew Wired was going to throw away my title, so I actually had it like called "Sentience and Sensibility" as as a joke off of Jane
I
Austen.
like that.
Then, yeah, but they called it something like "One day AI will be as human as we are. What then?" or something.
Not quite as catchy. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not catchy, but anyway, people knew what they were getting when they clicked on it. But it went down really well, so I do recommend reading it. I can't go over it at great length. But the basic idea, yeah, and Hinton, I also know Hinton. He did a lot of his education at Edinburgh, so kept coming back there. So, sorry. So yeah, Hinton had been at Edinburgh. And I've spent a lot of time at Edinburgh, so I have a good sense. I thought I had a good sense of him. And yeah, I only once met Dawkins through Dennett. But it's not about personal knowledge. I guess the point is that these people, for various reasons, very much wanted to believe something. And that's separable to me from what I would call consciousness. So going back, yeah, I was originally going to talk about consciousness, which is that as a psychologist, what I think about as consciousness is what you have explicit recall for. So can you remember what you had for breakfast this morning? Can you remember what you had for breakfast 3 years ago? Probably not, right? And unless it was an extraordinary breakfast of some kind, right? So there's this idea about the explicit and the implicit. And I do have, actually, my most cited paper is actually about the fact that artificial intelligence that's trained on our culture has the same implicit biases. In fact, it is basically all implicit biases that we have. And also, since we had that, we were able to show that the implicit biases that humans had reflected our lived experience phenomenally accurately. So you could say that it's an implicit bias to expect programmers to be male and to expect nurses to be female. But actually, if you looked at the U.S. Labor statistics, which the U.S. was dominating the internet at that time, 2015 or so, when the data had been scraped, that was pretty accurate, right? And so it was great because it said, oh yeah, so the implicit is basically bootstrapping off of lived experience, and the explicit is our planning. It's just us choosing a better reality, both as individuals, just choosing like how are we going to navigate or whatever, how are we going to walk home, but also as groups that we cooperate, we use language there. So this is the explicit stuff. So one of my first papers, I had like 3 or 4 papers on consciousness, and the first one was called "Consciousness is Easy, but Learning is Hard." And in that case, I was talking about this explicit recall, being able to say what had happened. And the thing is, or actually, in particular, I was talking about self-knowledge, because in a computer system, you have random access memory. You can access exactly, precisely everything that's going on. If that, you could store it, and you would know exactly what happened. If you're a robot, if you've built in the sensors, you can have perfect proprioception. You would know exactly what you're doing. And that wasn't smart, it was stupid. People thought consciousness was a big deal, and I was just saying, look, what are you thinking? So I spent a lot of time saying this isn't making sense, and then eventually I realized that it's not enough to say no, no, no. You have to say yes about something. And so now what I think is the most important part of what we really care about is not consciousness, but it's something we call moral agency. It's about who is responsible for what they do. And so it's not all agency, because there's trivial agents like chemical agents, but it's about who can we hold to account. And that was what I was saying a little bit earlier. The moral agency requires that you're more or less equals, that you if you do something wrong, the rest of society can motivate you to improve, right? And that's what responsibility is. It's almost a definition of it. So I think it's easy to build all kinds of ideas of consciousness, like explicit memory, being able to report what happened, having self-awareness, blah, blah. It's easy to build that into AI. We've been doing it for a long time. It's even not that hard to take that kind of information and then use it to retrain and update models in the background, which actually Hinton had a nice thing called the wake-sleep algorithm, like, in the 80s or something. He came up with a nice model, something like that. But it doesn't make it a person, right? I mean, like rats have this too, and we poison rats. We eat cows, and maybe we shouldn't be eating cows. But even bees and fruit flies and things have these kinds of things. It's not that big of a deal. And so getting people over thinking that this is a big deal, and all the sci-fi wants to, people don't want to die, so they want to believe that computers are perfect. They don't want to be wrong, so they think like, oh, if I was a computer, I would live forever and I would be perfect. It's like, I got news for you. Most hardware does not last as long as 80 years, right? Yeah. So anyway, consciousness, fine. I actually think there's plenty of AI systems that, if you could talk about like, oh, I have a robot over here. I don't know if you can see this. Here, I'll show you. If you look at that robot, you might say, oh, it's got a head, and it doesn't have feet, but it has hands, and it has a head or face or whatever. There is definitely AI systems that are as much like consciousness as that robot's head is like my head, right? That robot's head, it actually has a few touch sensors, but basically it's nothing like the kind of perceptual experience I have. And the processes, I don't even know if the processes are in the head. But we would still call that a head. And by that definition, fine. There's plenty of conscious AI, but it doesn't make a big deal. But what Dawkins, when he thinks he's seeing a reflection of himself in the mirror, Shannon Valor has written a nice. He thinks he's seeing a companion, and he's actually just seeing a reflection of himself. And on this giant, as you said, this giant screen, it's 99.99999% just a clever way of recalling what people tend to say. And I'm sure he's a super interesting part of that library, because he's such a smart guy himself. So that he's like accessing really interesting arguments through his window into our library, our collective culture. He can probably talk to his friend Dan too, but or something like Dan. But it doesn't mean that there's a there. There's not, if you can't just buy, like, you can't clone up various versions of people and then say, okay, now there's not even a countable number, but let's say I have 500 virtual agents, they get to vote now. No, it doesn't make sense, right? You can't turn money into people, or else democracy just collapses. And you have no way to constrain and stop the corporations from doing whatever they want to you. So I think it's important to make that distinction between, consciousness and all the other things that we associate with intelligence, and actual moral agency and moral patency, the kinds of things that we need to take care of and that we can hold to account.
I know we're running out of time very quickly, so just a very quick one. You'd be kind enough to join us while you're actually on the sabbatical writing a book. And maybe this is a nice distraction. I don't know, but without giving too much away, could you tell us what the book's going to be about?
Oh yeah, yeah, the kinds of stuff we've been talking about. Try what are the constraints of computation? What are the constraints of biology? The fact that cooperation is totally natural, that language is natural, consciousness is not that special. And that the systems that we use, like justice, to coordinate, and that government is the means by which people that cohabit a region coordinate, and ideally to produce public goods and to be more secure. That these kinds of systems are actually kind of analogous to consciousness and language and those kinds of things. And then how do we move forward? And I don't think we have to make, although I'm thinking very much in sort of like the 10,000 year, from back when we first were innovating writing, into like a symmetrically long distance into the future. We have a lot of how we do our ethics is not that different from other primate species so that we diverged from millions of years ago. Yeah. Some things are very, very special, and I do think we need a couple of new ways to deal with the fact that we're now having these sort of global, basically utilities. And then I also think we have these problems like you were just talking about dealing with the new concepts of ourselves, the new information space will be in. So I think there's a few problems for the political sciences and social sciences, and a lot more problems with humanities. So I think that the stupidest thing a country can do right now is stop funding its humanities programs and its universities.
Yeah, just a big thing in the UK. So University of Exeter, my university, they're sort of starting to cut humanities programs, which seems to be so and bizarrely in the US at the moment there are more people with a computer science degree who are not working than people with a philosophy degree. So which is wonderful for us, but it's very random.
Degrees, but yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was I really enjoyed the conversation.
Great.
And good luck with the book. I look forward to reading it when it comes out.
Okay. Yes.
Take care.
See you. Bye-bye.
Amen.